in 2007. But it's become structural, the same way that you see the other countries, like Portugal, Italy, Greece, become structural deficit countries, right? And I think that's what's often forgotten in this story. Competitiveness, sure, exports and imports, but what's the other side of this story, and that's the financial accounts. So here you see at the end of 2009, the net international investment position. And that's basically the flip side of the trade side, right? I mean, if you export more than you import, you have excess savings, and these savings are sent abroad. If you import more than you export, you have deficit in savings, and you need to get savings, you need to borrow, right? So you have borrower countries and debtor countries, and that's kind of the similar story in the G20. So you see the Germans owing, they owe a lot of money from abroad, the Dutch also. But then you see the kind of structural situation, especially Portugal. I mean, they have more money they owe the rest of the world that's bigger than their GDP. So this is the flip side of the competitiveness side. Don't blame wages, don't blame workers, don't blame competitiveness. But what happened first? The money, the excess savings went from Germany and France, German banks, French banks, who wanted a little bit higher return on their bonds. They got them in the Mediterranean. So that money goes there, right? That's the predatory lender approach, if you want. They gave them all this money, and then, of course, they use this money to buy German cars or whatever it is. So that's basically this story that we've seen. And that is probably the most important slide in Europe. Who owns all this debt? This is a percent of GDP. Foreign banks combined consolidated claims on Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, right? And the big story here is French banks. About a third of French GDP, and that's a big GDP, is owed by French banks in bonds from the Mediterranean countries and Ireland. So if these fail, then French banks fail. And if French banks fail, then we definitely have wider consequences for the financial system overall. And that's the big story here. Germany is big too, but not as big as French banks. But German, especially the Landesbanken, are in a similar kind of situation. So that's the story for the Eurozone, right? We thought that none of this mattered. It was a monetary union, and money could flow, capital could flow, it was a common market. These things shouldn't have mattered, especially not in a currency union. But now we see it did matter, right? Especially once governments needed to bail out their financial sectors, and this all came to break down. So, last case, the G20 and the global economy. Here they are, all waving at you, and that's my favorite picture of Berlusconi. I don't think he's laughing as hard anymore after the Merkel-Sarkozy press conference, where they both kind of two parents laughing at each other when they were asked about Italy and kind of saying, no, we don't know what we're going to do with that guy. So, of course, most people in Italy didn't get to see it because Berlusconi cleverly controls the media also. But, and I mean, yeah, I don't think he's laughing that hard these days, carefully keeping his coalition together. So what's the story in the G20? Well, a very similar story globally than we've seen in the Eurozone for the last couple of years. Here, of course, the green one is the United States, right? Persistent current account imbalances. Usually the story was, this is a twin deficit idea. The budget deficit is the deficit in the current account. You know, the budget deficit is financed from abroad. That's the idea. But here what we see in the 90s was this period of fiscal consolidation, that this current account deficit became structural. Sure, it's gone up somewhat, but that's because of the recession. You see the other countries, another persistent negative country is the United Kingdom. And then you've seen others like Saudi Arabia, China. I put some of the big players there. Germany, of course, and China is the highest. This has been going on, if you look at this graph, for the last 10 years, right? What does this mean again? China exports more than it imports, and it sends savings to the United States. The United States uses these savings to buy Chinese goods. That's how we've seen this game play. So who adjusts? Who's to blame? Well, here's then the debtor versus creditor story I'll get to in a minute when we talk about the politics. Also, these go, so this was competitiveness, right? This is exports minus imports, the biggest chunk. The flip side, of course, is savings, right? This is G20 savings as a percentage of total income. And look here what's happened in China. China was around 38% of GDP, and they're well above 50%. The other, Saudi Arabia has benefited from the oil boom, so they're well up. And then the structural savers, of course, joined by Japan and Germany. The two countries that haven't been saving as much, of course, have been the United Kingdom and the United States. So where do all these savings go with the Chinese? And this, I mean, by any means is phenomenal, right? China's official reserve accumulation, according to my colleague at SAIS, Peter Bottelier, they still are kind of, it's not official everything, so it's even worse. But he was like, it's become so embarrassing that they're only reporting the certain things that they want to go out. But, I mean, look where this graph started to take off. I mean, with a little bit of imagination, you know that this really was 98. What happened in 98? The Asian financial crisis. What was the lesson for China? We need to get us some reserves. That's exactly what they've been doing. Right? They've been building up their reserves from about $200 billion in 2000 to well over $3 trillion. Right? That, of course, the Europeans are now hoping they will use to buy Euro bonds or anything that they'll come up with soon with. And I think that's another graph, which is, it's taken from Reinhard and Rogoff from This Time is Different. And I mean, they're all over the news with this, and you know, the kind of whole rule that if you have 90% debt, your growth starts to slow down and things like that. But I think this is a more important story. This is the frequency of financial crisis. And they define it, I mean, they have a kind of whole methodology how they define it. Your stock market drops a certain percentage. There's a depreciation of the currency. I mean, all kinds of, I don't know exactly how they defined it, but that's how they came up with this kind of statistic. So, I mean, what strikes you when you look at this? Obviously, our first decade of the 20th century, about 20 crises. This stayed in the teens, the 20s. The Great Depression had a lot more financial crises. But then we've had 3 decades of no financial crisis. And people always wonder why that is. I mean, the answer is very clear, right? We didn't allow these things to get out of control. We had capital controls, we had managed capital, all that kind of stuff, which I'll come back to in a minute. But I think that's what's forgotten, because you often hear, well, we've always had financial crises. And it's true. We've had a lot of financial crises. But there's also been periods where we had a lot less financial crisis and a lot less volatility. And maybe there's some lessons from these 3 decades that can be learned. But it really is from the 70s onwards, when hand in hand with capital markets liberalization, 80s and 90s, that this kind of crisis frequency has taken off. Not just the frequency of crises, but the impact of crises also. Right? The tequila crisis was measured at $40 billion cost. The Asian crisis at around $200–300 billion. The current crisis, I mean, it's still ongoing. We don't know. It's $2–3 trillion now, the IMF estimated only in 2010. So that's another thing which we've seen. This is a global phenomenon, right? We've seen way more financial crises in the last 30 years. So how can we make this, all these graphs and all these data a little bit more interesting? Well, there's politics of imbalances, and that's where economic ideas and political ideas come in. So, what did these people, remember my favorite slogan of the Tea Party, get your government hands off my Medicare. And so this kind of whole phenomenon, which we've seen since 2008, what did these people have in common with these people? And these are, of course, sorry to focus purely on the Wall Street crowd. Of course, we have an occupied DC. Also, the revolution begins at home, you can see. What do they have in common? Or what do these people, the Greek public sector unions, as I'm sure we'll see a lot more of as they're gearing up for a referendum, have in common with these people? And these are the pictures taken from the British riots in August 2011. And you say, well, nothing. And they're extremes, right? They're crazy, right? They're whatever. I mean, we can happily have that debate after. But it seems to me they actually have more in common than you think. The only thing I've reversed is the priority, right? For the Tea Party, they're mostly angry at the government. Occupy Wall Street, I think, is mostly angry at the banks. But the most is really the same. They're angry at the government. They're angry at the banks. They're aware as to who is paying for the bailout. They do not feel represented anymore, and hence, and that's what's interesting for us political scientists, they're disillusioned with traditional democratic methods. This is not a traditional business, big business organized lobby that goes for small government. This is not a labor union movement that wants more money out of the system and wants to kind of squeeze capitalists or bankers, right? They basically don't go through these traditional methods anymore, right? In that sense, they almost have more in common with the Arab uprisings and so on. So they're disillusioned with traditional democratic methods, and of course, and I think I speak for all of us, they're like bubbles on the way up, but they hate them on the way down. But the proposed solution for both groups is that, well, somebody else needs to be paying for this. So what's the central problem I kind of want to drive home in this lecture, is that imbalances do not self-correct, right? And this is not my word. This is Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist at the IMF, admitted as much at the last annual meetings, the World Economic Outlook meetings of the IMF, the joint IMF World Bank meetings, that he said, well, they haven't self-corrected. He did admit that to a press conference because they're structural. Right? So there's a domestic imbalance, what you could call the 1%. I mean, it's populist, and of course, I mean, there's some point to it. The 1% versus 99%. What's interesting there is that most Republican candidates for the presidency kind of dismissed it out of hand at the beginning and are now changing their minds because they're kind of saying, well, of course we care about the 99%. Even Mitt Romney, who I'm sure does definitely not belong in the 99%, knows exactly how they feel. Structurally, he said that. Structurally, we have, and again, I refer to an article Neil, Shania, and I did for CNN last week, that there has been a lack of international coordination, which has worsened existing imbalances. I mean, this is the fundamental point at the structural level. This is what the G20 came up with. Growth-friendly fiscal consolidation. Well, I mean, you don't have to be an economist to kind of understand that this is very hard to achieve. Right? I mean, I know Alberto Alessina came up with one paper and, made some kind of case for this. But I remember, and you all know him if you studied macro, Robert Solow, Nobel Prize winner, was here at SAIS, and he was asked about this. And he was like, well, it strikes me as disingenuous. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He was like, well, it's always the same people that make the argument for smaller government during a recession. Those people never make the argument that during a boom time, if you want to slow down the economy, you should increase spending and cut taxes. They never make that case. So if you want to be intellectually coherent, it's like, well, then you have to make the case in a boom time that the government should start spending more and cut taxes to slow things down. He's like, but they never do it. So just say it. It's an ideological argument for smaller government. And I think he's right. I mean, I refer to Bob Solow on this. I mean, I didn't make this up. Ideationally, in many ways, I think, especially many political scientists thought that the 2008 financial crisis was the kind of final overstretch of neoliberal beliefs. But if you look at what's on offer these days, if you look at the austerity politics of today, it's maybe not true, right? We're still kind of stuck in this idea that, well, it must be somehow the government that's the problem. Even the Economist and the Financial Times have kind of turned around to that general idea because it's a narrative they're comfortable with, right? The other kind of thing that it's not the case is much harder to make. So, rounding off slowly, what are the lessons we can take from history from this? Because obviously, I mean, I've studied crises. I'm hoping to make a career out of this, I mean, at least in the short term. So, I mean, this is supposedly where we should learn from the past. We should learn from crisis what came out of it and what not. But before we look at this, I want to have a note of caution about linearity. Anybody remember this book? Dow 36,000. It came out, I think, late 99, 2000. It was kind of the idea that by 2011, I think 2015, the Dow Jones would be at 36,000 points. Well, it's below 12,000 today. So, I mean, it might well triple in the next 3 years. I don't know. It might still get there. But I think that's definitely not true. What's my caution about linearity? And this is very much something Tony Judd himself told me. He was like, well, what were the widespread assumptions in 1911 about the 20th century? He was like, well, they were threefold. The first was large-scale war is a thing of the past, of the 19th century. There's economic interdependence, there's too much to lose. We basically are never going to have this again. Wide-held belief. The second belief was that the 20th century was going to be Germany's century. Not the US, not Russia. I mean, in many ways, it was Germany's century in the first half. I mean, not for the reasons they thought. But in the end, the 20th century, I think it's now genuinely agreed upon, was the American century. So if you read now Arvind Subramanian's new book about eclipse, I mean, he's fairly certain that, I mean, this is already China's century to come. Could well be. I mean, I guess we'll know in 50 years. But we've thought along very similar lines 100 years ago. And then the third belief, widely held in Europe in the early 20th century, so about 100 years ago in 1911, was that nationalism was a thing of the past. That we had globalization now, people were individuals interested in cosmopolitan ideas and so on and so forth. And obviously, we know that the 20th century was probably one of the most important centuries when it came to nationalism. So, but what can we learn from the past? The 1930s, and this is, I think, what I want to stress the most, and I have stressed the most in my own work, is who controls the narrative. Because in times like these, right, when unemployment is persistently high, when it's perceived that some people are getting ahead and others aren't, and the majority is not getting ahead, this is kind of a fertile ground for radical politics. And then the question is, who controls the narrative, right? Somebody like Adolf Hitler in Germany controlled the narrative. It was very convincing, and most people went along with it. Remember, this guy was democratically elected, right? I mean, not a majority, but close to 40%. Of course, in the United States, the polar opposite was believed, right, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his New Deal politics was a much different alternative. Right? His explanation of what had gone wrong and how to fix this seemed convincing in the American theater. So you say, well, but that was the 30s, that's so long ago. I mean, surely we've learned from the past. Well, if you see pictures like these, this is taken a couple of days ago in Greece, burning German flags. I don't remember this. I mean, especially not in my lifetime. But this kind of sentiment within the European Union, if you talk about European solidarity and keeping this together, I mean, this is serious. When I see this worries me. And then I worry who's in power and who controls the kind of how things went wrong and how to fix it, the way out of the crisis. But we've had another crisis, right? The 1970s. That's my favorite Gone with the Wind poster. Of course, you recognize Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but they too seized the narrative, right? They said what went wrong, how to fix it. It was coherent, it was relevant, and it did have some kind of traction amongst the public. So the question then is, who adjusts? Who adjusts domestically, internationally, and globally? So if it's true that there's structural imbalances, we kind of need to, policymakers need to stress again the real economy versus the financial economy. Barack Obama is trying to do this, right? Trying to get people to become engineers that build bridges rather than financial engineers that build dreams, or whatever, however way he phrased it. The whole idea of capital versus labor needs to be rebalanced. And just a note on this. When I hear especially the kind of leading lights of Wall Street talk today, it reminds me a bit of labor union leaders in the 70s. Labor union leaders in the 70s also assumed that they were all-powerful, that they, controlled the government in many ways, and the votes and things like that. That power was lost in the 80s in many countries, right? And it was only 30 years that power lasted. I think that's the same with Wall Street. Their power has only been there for 30 years, right? It was cut drastically in the post-war period, in the first 30 years after World War II. So that could well happen again. Maybe not immediately, but I think I worry when I hear them speak. Because if I were them, I would be worried that somebody might burn my house down at some point, if this gets too worse. I mean, you laugh, but the riots in Britain, I mean, people in their Notting Hill restaurants who had to fight themselves off with bowls of champagne, I mean, that's just too good to come up with. But I mean, maybe that was just a one-off. I'm not sure. There is very good research, though, that shows the correlation between austerity and protest, right? So if austerity gets worse, I imagine protest is going to go worse. Does that justify the process? Probably not. But does it happen? Yes. Should we worry about it? for sure we should worry about it. And then the same domestic idea here of now this kind of radical anti-government feeling that we see. Again, we'll come back to that. Internationally, we need an adjustment between debtor and creditor nations. I mean, it's a lot easier to grow out of your problems if other countries are growing faster, right? And you can export to them. And it's a lot easier to let them adjust, and I'm talking about Greece and Germany here and about the US and China, if you kind of play this by the rules. But here, what's forgotten is America wants a lot out of China, right? Something so dear to their sovereignty, like their own exchange rate. They want them to have a market-based exchange rate. Well, obviously, we've had all kinds of exchange rates over the last 50 years, right? But you're going to have to give China something in return, right? And that's what I mean with you can't just change the quota at the IMF from 3.24 to 4.21 and say, well, we've given you more say. But you're going to have a more radical rethinking of how the international financial institutions are run. And you're going to have to actually give them a real say in this if you want this adjustment to happen. And that was my point on globally. If we want a new Bretton Woods system and a kind of, I mean, I don't want to go too far with this, but a kind of re-embedding of liberalism that we've lost in the 1980s, then we're going to have to listen to other ideas. And that's the last point, the return to pragmatism of the 1950s and 1960s. We had a financial crisis conference at SAIS in the spring of 2009, organized by Frank Fukuyama at the time. And during one of the breaks, I was talking to a Chinese scholar and an Indian scholar. And they, so we're talking, you know, all the niceties. And then they said, like, what's stunning, they said, is how ideological you guys are. You can't call it nationalization. You can't call it this. You can't call it that. You have to go back to the kind of medicine of the 80s and the 90s that you've been preaching. But it's like you're almost like we were under Mao and like the Indians were under Nehru, convinced of this is the only way to develop, to grow, right? What happened, they say, to you guys, pragmatism that you had in the 50s and the 60s, right? You kind of do what works, whether it's the state, whether it's the market. And now it's like still everything's fallen apart, but it's still not the belief that something that fundamentally was underlying this was or must have been wrong. And getting close to the end now, this is a quote from Elizabeth Warren, and I like it particularly. And she says very recently, I hear all this, you know, well, this is class warfare, this is whatever. No, there is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, well, good for you. But I want to be clear. You moved your goods to the market, on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers, the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come in and seize everything at your factory and hire someone to protect against this because of the work the rest of us did. Well, that's not some left-wing lunatic. And that's what I find interesting. Somehow the narrative has shifted that people like this are dangerous, scary, socialist. If you put them in power, somehow everything's going to be different and you're going to be like Europe, which that's the worst thing that could happen. And I mean, this is common sense, of course. Eisenhower built the interstate system. We all know this. I mean, the Chicago School built a new growth theory based on all of this. Educate your people, make sure they're healthy, right? Nobody is talking about taking the market away. But I think the fact that somebody like her can't even be appointed to something like the Consumer Protection Agency, I find that kind of scary. Because, I mean, in many ways, I don't find, I mean, of course, I'm European, so by definition, dangerous. But in that sense, I don't find anything that radical here that I find. I mean, she's running for the Senate now in Massachusetts. We'll see how she does. But, I mean, in general, if you believe that the narrative around her, it's kind of, this is someone who's just crazy. And again, I think we can all agree with this, that this is pretty common sense. So, to conclude, I want to bring back the primacy of politics. We have forgotten what real ideological politics were really like, especially my generation. Why? Because we grew up in the 80s and the 90s when it was the end of ideology. And that's in many ways been the curse of the great moderation, when politics always needed to serve economics. And that's sort of what most of us have grown up with. My generation and the generation ahead of me, again, became or worked in or kind of came to take for granted. The great post-war settlement, both in Europe and in the United States, was a conservative solution to the problems of the Great Depression and the World War. So I am talking to you tonight as a conservative. I'm worried. I'm worried about these imbalances. And I think correcting them will put you on a more sustainable path, right? And that is, let's not forget, the welfare state in Europe was put into place by Winston Churchill. I don't think any American knows anything bad about Winston Churchill. He's like this great guy. Charles de Gaulle, Clement Attlee, De Gasperi, all these guys had fought in World War I as young men, had lived through the Depression, had seen World War II, and that was their response. A welfare state, a big deal between capital and labor, between state and private. And we've kind of lost this kind of common sense idea. And somehow the narrative now is that these were those times and crazy left-wing that finally were then taken over in the 70s by Reagan and Thatcher saving the day. And I mean, they did correct many things that had gone too far, Reagan and Thatcher. Don't get me wrong. But they kind of took it too far. And I think that is the next point, is that something will have got to give in the process of adjustment. Because austerity policies work a lot better if the pain is equally shared, right? The idea that, sure, we'll take a hit, we can take it, but at least the ones that caused this are taking the biggest hit. Somehow, I think you need to be able to narrate this in this way. And then the last point, and that's my homework for all the students here, crises are periods of fundamental uncertainty. And so it's ideas and the narrative that will determine the future path. So what should be the alternative if it is true that there's a lack, that there's a vacuum, that there's a fertile ground for an alternative, right? What should that be? And you can write me a one-page essay, and I will expect it next week at the beginning of class. No, that was a joke. Anyway, happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Mark Blythe at the very end. They have a mic for you so everybody can hear, also on podcast.
Hello, hello, yes. Actually, you don't need it. I have a Scottish accent, so just project to the front. So let me take what you've said. Great talk, really great. I agree with all of it. Now let me make it worse for you. So it goes like this. If you talk about adjustment and imbalances, you're talking about surplus, deficit, creditor, debtor, and that assumes sort of someone's on this side, someone's on that side, and you come together in the middle, which is all very pragmatic, apropos your talk. So let's make this worse. Imagine the whole world as a giant collateralized debt obligation. This is how this is going to work. So the first tranche, the junior tranche, the risky bit, is stuff full of American mortgages and over-leveraged financial products. That went pop. The state came along and said, let's bail this out because the idea of 158 million Americans and 72% of them living paycheck to paycheck and 55 million handguns is probably a bad idea. So this lines up in the public balance sheet, and particularly in Europe where you come from a higher level of debt, this now becomes the Sovereign Debt Crisis Act 2. So this is basically the junior tranche has gone crap, the mezzanine tranche is now infected. What's left? The senior tranche. So what's the senior tranche? Senior tranche is China. And those $3 trillion of reserves. And now the Europeans are saying, please, please help us. But here's the problem, fundamentally, it's all linked systemically, because the US is $10 trillion of consumption, the EU's $10 trillion of consumption, and China's $1.9 trillion of consumption. So there's no way in God's green earth China can save the West. So if this is the case, the junior tranche is gone, the mezzanine's next to go, the super senior isn't safe. It's going to adjust, but not the way you hope.
Is there an actual question?
Yes. You're going to get adjustment, but not the way you think. What do you think of that as a proposition?
Yeah. You see, Mark, this felt like my dissertation defense all over again. So it started to shake. I